Welcome back. In this episode, we're going to talk about aligning items and aligning individual items. So there are some new settings inside of the container for aligning items, which you can find over here. We had a similar system with sections and columns, where if you would click on a column, you would have horizontal align over here, where you could do start, center, but it didn't always do something, and that was because there was no space for the items to move left and right, because the widgets automatically were 100% of the width. As you can see, even a button like this, it takes up the whole width of the box. That's why nothing happens when you change the horizontal alignment here. So what you had to do is you had to go into each individual widget and then change the width, for example, to inline auto, and then the horizontal alignment would actually do something. This was of course a bit tedious. So now with the container, that is much better. So by default, all of the widgets are still 100% of the width, as you can see, but if you now put the container on, for example, left align, now all of the widgets go back to their most minimum size that they can become according to the content that is inside of the box. So, for example, this title is longer, this box is longer because this text is longer. But if you would, for example, have this widget and there would be a lot more text in it, then it would also become the full width. So what's great about this feature is that now you don't have to go into the individual widgets to minimize them. You can just click over here and now all of this content is middle aligned. But let's say that the content is a little bit too big. So for example, this text is a lot more, then you can still change the width of the items for widgets in the advanced tab now. So the width setting is over here. You can still put it on something you want. Inline auto will not work here, which is the minimum size because there's too much text in it. So then you would have to work with a custom size like this. And then there is enough space left and right for this widget to actually be influenced by the aligned items. So just know by default, the widgets are stretched for the full width. But if you then start playing with the settings, then they become their most minimum width, but you can still change individual widgets if you want to. And in this example, this worked out great, but it's not always so easy because what a lot of people don't see is that this text is actually not middle aligned. Now, on desktop view, it looks like it, but what the align items is actually doing is that it's just aligning the widgets, but not the text. So let me show you what I mean. If this title becomes longer, so you add something after it, like this, I'm just adding some text, then you will see that this widget now is too big for the align items and it's still left aligned. And that is because it was left aligned always, because that's the default setting by Elementor for text widgets. This is also the case for this little text, but it's just too short. Because if you would go to mobile and you would add a little bit more text over here, then you would also see that even this text is actually left aligned. But again, on desktop, it looks middle aligned. So just know that the align items only aligns the widgets, but not the content inside of the widgets. So if you have a situation like this, you still have to go in here, go to style, and align the text in the middle, even though nothing changes over here. But on mobile, it does change. Sometimes it's visible like that, and then of course you will see it. So then you can align it in the center, and then it will also be middle aligned on mobile. What's also important to know about the align items feature is that it changes when the direction of the container changes. So right now this container is in vertical mode. By the way, if it doesn't show anything, it's still in vertical mode because this is the default mode. But let's say that you change this one to row and you put everything in horizontal alignment. Then you will see that these one changed. Let me do it again. You see, they rotate. So when it's in horizontal mode, you can align the items to the top and to the bottom if there is space. You see, these three items change because there is actually space. Because this big item creates some space inside of this container. So in horizontal mode, the height of the container is defined by the highest or tallest item inside of the container. So in horizontal mode, it works the same. If you don't set up anything here, then the items will have not the maximum width, but the maximum height, because right now we're in horizontal mode, therefore all of the items become their maximum height. And in this case, the maximum height is the height of the tallest item, because otherwise it will go on forever down here. So then Elementor just takes up the height for the longest item. So again, here it's the same. Now they're 100% of the height. When you click over here, then they go back to their original size, and then you can play around with them. This doesn't seem like a very useful example, so I will show you another one. For example, with this horizontal section over here, you have 3 containers in horizontal direction. So if you click on the outer container, which contains all of them, and you click on the start, then they will go back to their original size. You see what happened there? If I click it, you see, it goes back. It's a little bit hard to see because of the background. So let me change the background just for this example. Okay, so let's do it again. You will see, now they go back to their original size. So you can also use this to align things like this. Or for example, with a pricing table where you don't want all of the items inside of it to have the same height. So here you can do the same trick. You click on your container and then you click on align items. They will go back to their most minimum size, which is perfect for a pricing table. So let's go back to this example. We can put it on top, middle, or the bottom like that. And then the last feature that you should know is individual alignment. So here we have align items, and the little brother of align items is align self. 3 items we have in here, 3 containers. Let's say that we want to put this container at the bottom. So this main container says that all of the containers inside of it should be aligned at the top and not at the bottom. So at the top, but let's say that we want this one at the bottom. We can click on this one, then go to advanced, align self, and then just this one is at the bottom. So align self ignores what you have set up in the container that is above it, and it just overwrites it. Sometimes this can be useful. I don't use it that often, but sometimes you want to align a button to the other side somewhere. So then you know that it's there. It's just to individually change something when the container above it already has align item settings. So that's all you need to know for align items and align self. Let's now move on to more alignment settings called justify content. Welcome back. In this episode, we're going to talk about a default feature which I think that you want to turn off, which is auto padding. So when you drag in a container, it always adds a little bit of space before adding the next element in it. You can see that over here, when you keep adding containers inside of containers, it will always add 10 pixels. And these 10 pixels are set up by Elementor. But this is actually so unuseful in responsive design and making sure your design actually looks good. Because let's say you have a situation like this, right? You have a pricing table, you have some text, and then you drag 3 elements in it. But here you can see that there's this little space over here and this little space over here. Let me copy a little divider so we can see exactly what I mean here. Our actual grid, our 1140 grid, or actually 1120 because I already changed it, like I explained to you in the boxed container episode, is touching the sides. So this divider is perfectly aligned to the grid. But then these boxes both have 10 pixels left and right. They are not aligned. And that is because of that default 10 pixels. So Elementor automatically adds that, but I don't like it because then you always have to go into the advanced settings and unlink them. And now they are aligned to the grid, as you can see. Perfect. But this is very frustrating because this means that you have to do that for every single inner container that you have, which is a lot of work and you can forget it. And then the settings are different on mobile. So what I highly recommend is to turn it off on the full website inside of the site settings. So if you go to the site settings and you go to layout over here, you can turn off the container padding. If you just type in 0 over here, then it will be deleted everywhere. So if you then click on Save Changes and go back to your page, then you will see that the padding is not here even though I didn't delete it. There is a disadvantage though to this approach, and that is that your visual help disappears. So right now I did not refresh this page yet. So this is still having the old settings. So let me refresh this page. Now you only can see 2 containers. And why is that? Well, they are still here, but they are hidden. They are on top of each other. How you can see that is if you open the layers panel, or they now call it structure, you can see that all of our containers are still here. But since the padding is not there, they are just on top of each other, perfectly aligned, so you cannot click them. So That's why I always work with the layers panel in order to make sure. That's the sacrifice you have to make in order to not constantly having to go to advanced and then unlink the padding. I am willing to make that sacrifice. Maybe you are not. So this is just my advice. Do with this whatever you want, but I suggest to just keep the layers panel always open so that you can easily click, maybe sometimes even rename your layers to make it easier to find things for yourself. But I rather work with the layers panel than having to constantly delete the padding. You are working with the layers panel in your design tool anyways as well. But again, this is up to you. I just wanted to show both sides of this argument. All right, that was it for this episode. Let's move on to the next one. Hey, and welcome back to another episode, a very important one about the boxed container, the first alignment option you will come across when you start working with the container. So, every container has two modes, the boxed mode and the full width mode. Every time you drag in a container, it automatically goes to boxed, but you can also put it on full width. But here it doesn't seem to make any change, so what is the difference? You can mainly see this on background containers. So here you can see a background container, which is basically the first container before you put other containers inside of it, right? So you click on it and then you will see that it's boxed. If I put this on full width, then you will see that the content will stretch to the sides of the screen. You don't always see this when the widgets don't have enough content, like with this header and this button, but when the text is long enough, and especially with a divider widget like this with a line, then you can clearly see that now the content is absolutely full width. This, of course, is not what you want for most websites, because the background container on most websites have a boxed layout. Let me show you what I mean. So this is the website that I use for the course, and let me put on my box layout grid. This is a feature in Figma, which you do not have in Elementor, unfortunately. You can turn on a grid, a 12-column grid, to see if your design is aligned. So here you can see this text does not go beyond this grid. This image does because it's custom positioned, but if you go down, you will see that most of the content will stay within the grid. This of course gives the design structure and makes it easy for the eye to scan the website. Show you another example right here. Oh, oops, here you can see that I didn't align it correctly. Now it's within the grid. So if you have a background container that spans from here to here, then this part is called the boxed container. And you put it on box, then it will automatically keep the content within that box. So basically the boxed container just adds another container right here in your background container, which of course is very convenient because if this feature was not here, then we always had to add another container in here, give it a certain width in order for the content to not exceed to the sides of the screen. So this saves you from using one extra container. For most websites, this box does not scale. The sides do scale. So let me close this panel, then you can see that the sides become wider, but this box still stayed the same. You can measure that if I take my screenshot tool and I go from here to here, you can see that this is 1140. And even when I make my window smaller, you will see that this box will stay 1140. Let me show you another example. Here I have visualized it with the container. So here we have a background container. We have an inner container, which is this one is 1120. I will put it back on 1140. And then these boxes scale. So if you just close the panel, then you will see very visually that that is how it works. This box stays in a fixed pixel width. This is, by the way, similar to how sections and columns worked with the old system, because when you would create a section, it would automatically give you this inner column, which is also basically a box container. So you are already used to working in this way, but now you just need to make sure that your background container is unboxed because you don't see it in a visual way as we saw it with this inner column, or column, I should say. So this is great for desktops because some desktops are super wide and some desktops are smaller. I've heard a lot of people say that using this pixel width is not really good because you have people with 4K screens. Well, I am right now on a 4K screen, and 4K screens do actually scale up the pixels. So in most cases, 1 pixel is actually not 1 pixel, but they use 4 pixels to make it sharper, or 3, or there's some calculation to it. So I just want to tackle this right now. You can just safely use the 1140 grid and it will still look great on a 4K screen. And even if there are people with a 4K screen who have like super wide screens, most people have super wide screens in order to have multiple windows open so they don't stretch their window full width. So therefore, please don't worry about that. 1140 is a great size for most websites, and that's why Elementor has that size by default. On tablet and mobile though, it's another story. So let me go to mobile right now. Here, it doesn't make sense to use pixels because the tablet sizes and mobile sizes are so different that it would not be smart to use pixels. So here you can then switch from pixels to percentages. I've now put this at 80%. Let me put it back at 100 with this slider. Now you can see it's still on box, but it's 100% of the width. So the width slider right here actually defines the width of the inner box and not the actual width of the whole container. But that is only the case when it's on box, because when it's on full width, then the width slider decides the width of the whole container. But right now we're talking about background containers where you use boxed. So then the width slider decides the inner box. So like I said, if you put it on percentages, then it's much better because it doesn't matter how big or how small the tablet may be, it will automatically scale 80%. This also saves you from adding padding left and right on each container, which we had to do with the old system with sections and columns in order to create some space on the left and on the right here. It's simple. You don't even have to put padding left and right. Maybe only top and bottom, but not left and right, because you just put the container on 80% and it will scale perfectly. On a mobile, it's the same story. Then 80 is a little bit too small, so 85 or 90 is better. I will show you 90, how that looks. That looks a little bit like this. But for more luxurious websites, you can put it a little bit smaller, like this. That also looks good. In a later episode, I will show you how you can set this up globally, so for your whole website, so that you don't have to set it up for every single container, because it's kind of annoying to change it afterwards if you've set it up everywhere and then you have to go back into every container. So I will show you how to do that on a global level. But for now, just remember that on mobile and tablet, percentages are better. And for desktop, the normal default 1140 pixels is okay for most websites. Later in the course, I will also make an argument why you would want to use percentages for desktop. But honestly, if I would have to use pixels for desktop forever, I would also be fine with it because it just works for most screens. One thing that I forgot to add is that you can also use the box model in order to make very small boxes like this. So by default, the box is automatically at 1140, like I explained, but you can also make it smaller. So sometimes that is useful if you want a design like this. You could, if you want to, go even lower, even though this slider doesn't go lower than 500. If you just type in a number here, for example, 400, oh, not 4,000, 400, then you can see that it can be even smaller, or 300. So just know that that is also something you can do, because sometimes you might want a layout like this. So let's talk a little bit about that 1140, because this number is here. Like, why is it here? It feels random, right? But it's actually not random. It's a very popular size in web design. And let me show you why that is. And I am not 100% sure that this is the reason, but I am pretty sure that this is the reason. This is an assumption, okay? So back in the day when I went to design school, the screens were smaller. So this is approximately, 10, 15 years ago, the screens were smaller. And therefore, most websites had 960 as the main boxed container. And people still used columns, as I have in Figma as well, in order to make their design experience a little bit easier, but the screens were simply smaller. But then many laptops came out with a screen that was 1366. That was a popular size for screen sizes. Or actually this was before Full HD was a thing. This was a screen size that was very popular. And then of course Full HD came along, 920 pixels by 1080 high. So this is the width, this is the height. And then people were like, hey, we have more space on our computer. Why not make the website a little bit bigger? So people started to experiment with wider websites. And that's when 1140 became popular. And why is that? Okay, so here's my assumption. In order to make the design experience nicer, you want to work with columns. So this is not relevant for people who use Elementor for design, but I know many of you use a tool like XD or Figma to do this. So let me explain a little bit about design. So when you are designing, a lot of times it happens that you need to create columns. So for example, this, you need to create 3 columns or 3 containers like this. And then you want to know how wide they should be. So if you then use a grid like this with 12 columns, then it's easy because 12 can be divided by 4, which then creates 3, can be divided by 3, which then creates 4, 2, which creates 6, etc. So let's say that without the grid, you want to create 2 boxes that are the same size. Like, how wide should they be? Then you keep it like this, like how wide should it be? But if you use a grid, it's easy. You just pick 6 columns over here, 6 columns over here, and boom, 20 pixels in between, which is also a popular size to create some natural space in between objects. And boom, you have a perfectly aligned 2-column layout. The only option that is not possible is a 5-container grid, but then you need to do some calculations. But 3, 4, and 2 are all possible, which are very common in web design. So that's why the 12-column grid is very popular. And 20 pixels of space between objects is also very popular. Elementor also uses that as the default value. So if you click on any container, well, not this one because I changed it, most containers have the default value on 20. This is actually set up on all Elementor websites, 20 pixels, because Elementor also thinks that that's a great gap between the objects. That is in a vertical position, but also in a horizontal position like that. All these gaps are 20 pixels. So back in the day when the box container was smaller because screens were smaller, the box container was 960 pixels, because if every column is 60 pixels and you use 20 pixels of spacing in between, then you will get to 960. So let me do another calculation. You have columns of 60 pixels times 12, because we want to use 12-column grid. Then we also want to have gaps of 20 pixels times 12 gaps. Like you see, this is 960. And then when the screens became bigger, they changed 60 for each column to 75. And there you go, 1140. Again, this is an assumption, but mathematically it makes a lot of sense why the web now uses this as a default. Some websites use percentages all the way, which is also fine, but many tools like Elementor use 1140, and this is the math that makes sense. But I already hear some of you guys saying, yeah, that's great, Reno, but there are not 12 gaps of 20, because there are actually 11 gaps, because we have 12 columns and there are only 11 gaps. And that is because the 20 pixels of spacing is actually not 20 pixels between the columns, it's 10 pixels left of each column and 10 pixels right. It just creates some safe space for each column, meaning that if you do this all the way to the right, then you will have 12 times 10 plus 10, which then fulfills this calculation. Again, this is quite mathematical. You don't have to understand it. I just wanted to explain why Elementor uses this so you feel confident that this is just a good number to work with. But the other reason why I'm explaining this is because my design is aligned to the grid and not to the sides of these little blocks, which means that my design is not 1140, but it only spans to 1120. So if you really want to follow the 1140 grid and you want to use the 12-column grid to design in a tool like Figma, which I do recommend, then your main container should actually be 1120. So you do not change that over here, but it's much smarter to change that in the site settings. So if you go to the site settings and then to layout, you will see over here that you can change the width of the whole website from 1140 to 1120. So this is for the people that really care about pixel perfect design and want to make sure that their design from Figma with the 12-column grid looks exactly the same in Elementor. Then make sure to change this to 1120. For people that want to use percentages all the way, then this doesn't really matter. So you can just leave it at 1140. But I wanted to say this because I know many of you guys also care about pixel perfect design. All right, I'm going to click Save the Changes for now and go back. So now you really understand the difference between the box and the full width. So for background containers, you always use box unless you have a really cool creative design. Let me give you another example. For example, a design like this where you have things on the side. well, then you can use full width, but this is a little bit more advanced. But most websites that have a fixed layout want to use the box for the background, and then all of the containers that are inside of your background container will have to be on full width, otherwise you will get another box inside of that container. So it's a bit annoying that Elementor by default puts it on box when you drag in a new container, because almost all of the containers you use are on full width. I hope that when you're watching this, they've changed this, but for now we have to change it quite often to full width. So that's all you need to know for the box container, a very important concept. Let's now move on to the next episode.